After 15 years serving as a state trooper and living in a modest apartment near the precinct, I finally achieved what felt like the American dream. A stunning colonial home in Oak Ridge Estates, complete with a wraparound porch, mature oak trees, and a circular driveway that had instantly caught my eye during the viewing. The neighborhood looked like something out of a real estate magazine. Pristine lawns, elegant homes with tasteful holiday decorations, and neighbors who offered friendly waves as they walked their perfectly groomed dogs. During the closing, my realtor hesitated slightly when reviewing the HOA documents. "Just so you know, Oak Ridge has a particularly active homeowners association," she mentioned, choosing her words carefully. "The previous owner wanted me to make sure you understood that." I brushed off her concern. After all, I'd spent my career enforcing rules and regulations. How difficult could a suburban HOA possibly be? My first clue should have been the HOA welcome packet. It wasn't just a few pages of basic guidelines. It was a 3-ring binder containing 127 pages of bylaws, amendments, and what they called community aesthetic standards. The section on approved mailbox posts alone was 6 pages long, complete with technical diagrams and color swatches. Still, I remained optimistic. Organization and clear guidelines were good things, right? The mandatory new resident orientation was scheduled for my first Saturday in the house. It was held in the community clubhouse, an imposing brick building that looked more like a small courthouse than a neighborhood gathering space. That's where I first met Barbara Wellington, the HOA board president and self-proclaimed guardian of community standards. Barbara sat at the head of a mahogany conference table, designer glasses perched on her nose, meticulously reviewing violation reports. Her gray hair was styled in an immaculate bob, and she wore what I'd later learn was her signature look, a pastel cardigan set and pearl necklace. Everything about her screamed retired school principal who still enjoys giving detentions. "Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates," she said, not looking up from her papers. "We'll begin once everyone has completed their attendance cards and submitted their exterior paint color preferences for future reference." Her voice carried the same warmth as a parking ticket. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I mentioned being a state trooper, thinking it might help build rapport with the board. The slight tightening around Barbara's eyes told me I'd made a tactical error. Her smile remained fixed, but something shifted in her demeanor. "How interesting," she said, making a small note in her leather-bound notebook. "We'll certainly need to discuss vehicle regulations." That discussion came exactly 1 week later in the form of a crisp white envelope in my mailbox. Inside was my first violation notice, printed on heavy cardstock with the HOA logo embossed in gold. Violation: non-approved vehicle in driveway. Reference: Bylaw 7.32. No commercial or emergency vehicles permitted in visible areas. Fine: $150. Compliance required within 48 hours. They were targeting my patrol car, the same vehicle I'd parked in my driveway during the house showing and closing. When I called Barbara to explain that state law protected emergency vehicles from such restrictions, her response chilled me to the bone. "Rules are rules, Officer Davis," she said, that artificial smile evident even through the phone. "Your profession doesn't exempt you from our standards. In fact, as a law enforcement officer, shouldn't you be especially mindful of following regulations?" That's when I realized my dream home came with a nightmare I never anticipated. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of Barbara's campaign to either drive me out of Oak Ridge Estates or break me into submission. I'd faced down armed suspects and handled tense hostage negotiations, but something told me this suburban power play would test every ounce of patience and strategy I developed over my career. Game on, Barbara. Game on. The morning after receiving my first violation notice, I decided to handle this situation the way I would approach any investigation, systematically and by the book. I printed out the state statute protecting emergency vehicle parking, highlighted the relevant sections, and attached it to my formal variance request form. I even included photos showing how my patrol car was parked well within the driveway boundaries, not causing any obstruction or eyesore. 3 days later, Barbara's response arrived via certified mail. Inside the envelope were 3 separate violation notices, each printed on that same pretentious gold-embossed cardstock. 1. Violation. Light bar constitutes unauthorized exterior lighting. Fine, $200. 2. Violation. Vehicle exceeds acceptable height restrictions. Fine, $150. 3. Violation. Non-approved security camera installation. Fine, $250. The last one caught me off guard. I hadn't installed any security cameras yet. When I called to point out this error, Barbara's response was immediate. The dashcam in your patrol vehicle counts as a surveillance device under Bylaw 9.41. The fine stands. I requested a hearing with the full HOA board, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. As I sat in the clubhouse waiting room, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Did you see how Barbara handled the Peterson situation? One board member whispered to another. They challenged her on the tree removal fee, and suddenly their property assessment tripled. They had to sell. Well, what did they expect? The other replied. Nobody wins against Barbara. She used to be a corporate liability lawyer. She knows every loophole in the books. The hearing itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive bureaucracy. Barbara sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 6 other members who seemed to function more as an audience than participants. As I presented my case, citing state laws and property rights, she maintained that artificial smile while systematically dismissing each point. While we appreciate your enthusiasm for legal interpretation, she said, examining her manicured nails, our bylaws were written by top HOA attorneys. Section 12.34 clearly states that state statutes are superseded by our contractual agreement when you purchase the property. That was legally questionable at best, but before I could argue further, she continued, however, we're willing to be reasonable. Remove the light bar, paint the vehicle a subdued color from our approved palette, and we'll reduce the fines to a warning. We find that new residents often need time to adjust their expectations. The condescension in her voice made my jaw clench. The light bar is essential emergency equipment. I'm not modifying a state-issued vehicle. Then I'm afraid we'll need to add a non-compliance fee to your existing violations. Barbara replied, already reaching for another violation form. And do be aware that unpaid fines accrue interest at 18% annually. As I left the clubhouse that evening, I noticed something odd. The board members' parking spaces were filled with vehicles that seemingly violated their own rules. A jacked-up pickup truck belonging to the treasurer, the secretary's RV, and Barbara's Mercedes SUV, which had tinted windows far darker than the 50% minimum transparency required by their precious bylaws. I took out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting each violation. 2 could play at this game. If Barbara wanted to wage a campaign of selective enforcement, she was about to learn why state troopers are trained to notice details. What I didn't know then was that Barbara had already launched Phase 2 of her plan to drive me out of Oak Ridge Estates. The vehicle violations were just the opening salvo in what would become a suburban war of attrition. But unlike her previous targets, I wasn't going to back down. Sometimes the thin blue line needs to stand firm, even in the face of HOA tyranny. Barbara's campaign of harassment entered its 2nd month with the precision of a military operation. Every morning, I'd find new violation notices, each more absurd than the last. My American flag was mounted at an incorrect angle. The grass was 1.2 inches above regulation height. Even my mailbox became a target. Apparently, its post was 3 inches too tall, and painted in non-approved semi-gloss instead of satin finish. But then Barbara made a critical mistake. She started targeting my next-door neighbor, Sarah Chen, a single mom who'd lived in Oak Ridge Estates for 5 years with her 2 kids, Max and Lucy. Sarah's crime: speaking up at the last HOA meeting in my defense. Officer Davis's patrol car makes me feel safer, Sarah had said, standing despite Barbara's attempts to move past the public comment period. My children love waving to him when he comes home from shift. If anything, we should be grateful to have law enforcement living in our community. The retaliation was swift. Within days, Sarah received violations for her children's basketball hoop, non-approved recreational equipment, their chalk drawings on the sidewalk, defacement of community property, and even the color of her garden hoses: forest green instead of approved hunter green. The fines totaled over $800. That's when I noticed something interesting. While documenting these violations, I spotted a pattern. The same enforcement officer, Ted Wilkins, was issuing all our citations. But Ted mysteriously overlooked identical infractions at certain other houses, particularly those belonging to Barbara's inner circle. I started talking to other neighbors, and the stories poured out. The Patels had been fined for having ethnic decorations visible from the street during Diwali. The Johnsons were cited for their son's wheelchair ramp being an unauthorized structure, despite providing full medical documentation. Every story had the same theme: resist Barbara, face consequences. But people were afraid to fight back. Barbara has friends in the county assessor's office. Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to me over her garden fence: cross her, and suddenly your property taxes skyrocket. I decided to dig deeper. My years in law enforcement had taught me to follow the money. I submitted a formal request for the HOA's financial records, a right guaranteed to every homeowner under state law. Barbara tried to stonewall me, claiming the documents were under review, but I persisted. While waiting for the records, I set up a private meeting with Sarah and a few other affected neighbors in my garage. I brought coffee and donuts. They brought their violation notices and stories. We started mapping out connections on a whiteboard: who got cited, who didn't, and why. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to her latest fine. The violation form lists Premier Property Services as the inspection company. Isn't that owned by Barbara's brother? A quick property records search confirmed it. Barbara's brother, James Wellington, had incorporated Premier Property Services just 2 months before being awarded the HOA's inspection contract. The contract was worth $50,000 annually, paid for by our dues. But the real bombshell came from elderly Mr. Peterson, who lived across the street. He'd been quietly documenting HOA activities for years, ever since Barbara had tried to force him to remove his late wife's rose garden. "You need to see this," he said, sliding a folder across my kitchen table. Inside were photos of Ted Wilkins receiving envelopes from Barbara in the clubhouse parking lot late at night. The dates corresponded exactly with major enforcement actions against homeowners who had opposed Barbara's policies. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just selective enforcement. This was systematic corruption. But before I could act on this information, Barbara made her boldest move yet, one that would prove to be her ultimate undoing. Barbara's masterstroke came in the form of a community-wide email, sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night while I was working the late shift. The subject line read, "Mandate Toari, Annual Community Standards Gala, Parking and Access Restrictions." The email detailed plans for the HOA's upcoming celebration of community excellence and compliance. Essentially a self-congratulatory party for Barbara and her inner circle. But buried in the third paragraph was the real poison pill. Due to the prestigious nature of this event, the circular driveway at 1447 Oak Manor Drive, my address, will be designated as VIP overflow parking. All residents at this address must relocate their vehicles for the 48-hour period surrounding the event. Non-compliance will result in immediate towing at owner's expense. She'd scheduled the gala to coincide with my weekend shift rotation, knowing full well I'd need to leave my patrol car in the driveway. It was a perfectly crafted trap. Either I'd have to park blocks away and walk to my car in full gear, or I'd create a scene by trying to access my own driveway during their precious event. I was halfway through my shift when the email arrived, handling a multi-car accident on the highway. By the time I returned to the station to file my report, 3 more HOA emails had arrived. 6:15 a.m. Reminder: all non-approved vehicles must be removed within 36 hours. 7:30 a.m. Update: towing company has been placed on standby. 8:45 a.m. Final notice: any interference with the Community Standards Gala will result in immediate legal action. My sergeant noticed something was off during shift change. Davis, you look like you're about to blow a gasket. Everything okay? I showed him the emails. His face darkened as he read through them. Wait a minute, he said, reaching for his coffee. Isn't that the same HOA that tried to force Rodriguez to remove his Marine Corps flag last year? The one with that Wellington woman. That caught my attention. Barbara Wellington. What happened with Rodriguez? Oh man, you don't know. She tried the same strong-arm tactics with him. Threatened to tow his car during some garden club event. But when she found out he documented all her selective enforcement and was ready to file a civil rights lawsuit, she backed down fast. Last I heard, she even gave him some kind of community service award to sweep it under the rug. That's when it hit me. For months, I'd been playing defense, carefully documenting violations and building evidence. But Barbara wasn't going to stop. She'd keep escalating until she drove me out, just like she'd done to others before me. Back home, I found Sarah waiting by my mailbox. Her kid's basketball hoop had been removed overnight. Apparently, Ted Wilkins had deemed it an immediate safety hazard, requiring emergency action. Lucy, her 10-year-old daughter, was crying on their front porch. They didn't even let us get Max's height measurements off the post. Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. We've been marking his growth there for 3 years. Something snapped inside me. This wasn't just about parking spots or paint colors anymore. Barbara and her cronies were systematically destroying our community, breaking down residents through a campaign of intimidation and selective harassment. I walked into my home office and opened my investigation files. The evidence was all there. The financial connections, the selective enforcement patterns, the late-night meetings with Ted Wilkins. But I'd been too focused on defense. It was time to switch to offense. I picked up my phone and dialed a number for the State Attorney General's White-Collar Crime Division. This is Trooper Michael Davis, I said when they answered. I need to report suspected HOA fraud and conspiracy. Barbara wanted to play hardball. Fine. She was about to learn why you don't declare war on a state trooper who specializes in criminal investigations. The State Attorney General's office moved faster than I expected. Within hours of my call, I was sitting in a conference room with Senior Investigator Martinez, laying out my evidence. The photos of late-night meetings, the financial records showing payments to Barbara's brother's company, the pattern of selective enforcement. It all painted a clear picture of corruption. This is thorough, Martinez said, flipping through my documentation. Most HOA complaints we get are emotional rants. But this, she held up my timeline of events. This is the kind of detailed work we usually see from law enforcement. I couldn't help but smile. Funny you should mention that. Martinez's eyes lit up when I showed her my badge. A state trooper. Oh, Mrs. Wellington really stepped in it this time. She pulled out her phone. Let me call Judge Peterson. We need to expedite some subpoenas before any records mysteriously disappear. But I wasn't done. While the state investigation would handle the criminal aspect, I had other plans brewing. I'd learned from Sarah that Barbara's power partially stemmed from keeping her victims isolated. Time to change that. I created a private Facebook group called Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners United and quietly invited trusted neighbors. Within 24 hours, we had 50 members sharing their stories. The Paddles posted photos of their Diwali decorations before and after Barbara's cultural compliance demands. The Johnsons shared their legal bills from fighting the wheelchair ramp citation. Each post added another piece to the puzzle. Mr. Peterson, our elderly neighbor with the rose garden, turned out to be a retired investigative journalist. Barbara's been sloppy, he said during our secret meeting in my garage. Look at these bank statements from the HOA's public records. See these maintenance charges? They match exactly with deposits to her personal account at First National. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ted Wilkins's wife, Nancy, reached out through the Facebook group. She was tired of her husband's involvement in Barbara's schemes. Ted's been keeping records of everything. Nancy revealed over coffee in my kitchen. Barbara promised him a seat on the board if he helped target certain homeowners. But he's worried about liability. He'll talk to your investigator if you can guarantee some leniency. Meanwhile, Barbara remained oblivious to the net closing around her. She was too focused on her upcoming community standards gala. Every day brought new emails about parking arrangements and dress codes. All attendees must wear HOA-approved colors. See Appendix C of the bylaws. 3 days before the gala, I made my move. First, I had my attorney send a certified letter to the HOA board. This letter serves as formal notice that the property at 1447 Oak Manor Drive, including its circular driveway, is private property. Any attempt to use or block said property without owner consent will constitute criminal trespass. Furthermore, any attempt to tow vehicles from this property will result in immediate legal action. Then I contacted every local news station. Want to cover a story about HOA corruption, selective enforcement, and discrimination? I have documentation, witness statements, and a state investigation in progress. Barbara's response was predictably swift. She called an emergency board meeting, probably hoping to intimidate me into backing down. Instead, she found herself facing a room full of angry homeowners, each clutching copies of financial records showing years of mismanagement. The look on her face when she realized her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling. That moment almost made the months of harassment worth it. Almost. But Barbara wasn't going down without a fight. As she stormed out of the meeting, she turned to me with a look of pure venom. "You have no idea what you've started," she hissed. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." I was ready, all right. Because while Barbara was planning her precious gala, I had arranged a special surprise of my own. The next 48 hours would change Oak Ridge Estates forever. The morning of the Community Standards Gala arrived with perfect weather and absolute chaos. I'd parked my patrol car and personal vehicle strategically at both ends of my circular driveway, effectively blocking Barbara's planned VIP parking area. By 7 a.m., her pristinely decorated event setup crew was having a collective meltdown. "This is your final warning." Barbara's voice carried across the lawn as she marched toward my front door, her designer heels sinking slightly into the grass. "Move these vehicles immediately, or I'm calling the police and our attorneys." I opened the door in full uniform, badge gleaming. "Good morning, Barbara. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This is private property, as clearly documented in the county records I sent you. Also, I gestured to the unmarked vehicles pulling up along the street. The police are already here." Senior Investigator Martinez stepped out of the first car, followed by 2 deputies and a forensic accountant. "Mrs. Wellington, we have a warrant to seize HOA financial records and electronic devices." What happened next would be talked about in Oak Ridge Estates for years to come. As the investigators continued gathering evidence from the clubhouse, Barbara suddenly found her second wind. She stood up, smoothed her cardigan, and played what she thought was her trump card. "This is all a misunderstanding," she announced, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I can explain everything. In fact," she pulled out her phone, "I'm calling the chief of police. Charles Wellington. My husband." The crowd murmured. I couldn't help but smile. "You mean former Chief Wellington, the one who retired last year after that internal affairs investigation?" Barbara's hand trembled. "He was cleared of all charges. Actually," Investigator Martinez interjected, "the case was suspended when he agreed to retire. But now that you've brought it up," she pulled out a tablet. "We found some interesting emails between your personal account and certain developers who received favorable treatment from the HOA. The same developers who made generous donations to your husband's police foundation." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Years of mysterious zoning changes and property purchases suddenly made sense. Barbara had been using the HOA as part of a larger scheme, leveraging her husband's position to benefit developers while making life hell for residents who stood in their way. Ted Wilkins stepped forward, his manila envelope now in Martinez's hands. "The targeted enforcement wasn't random," he admitted, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Barbara gave me lists of homeowners to focus on. Usually people who opposed new development projects or questioned HOA finances." Sarah gasped from her porch. "Is that why you kept citing us?" "Because I spoke at the city council meeting against that new strip mall. The one being built by Wellington Development Group," I added. "Interesting coincidence, isn't it?" Barbara's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. Everything I did was for the community. These people with their tacky decorations, their basketball hoops, their patrol cars, they were destroying property values. Someone had to maintain standards." "Standards like embezzlement?" Martinez asked, reviewing the forensic accountant's preliminary findings. "Care to explain why HOA dues were being funneled through shell companies into your personal accounts?" That's when Barbara made her fatal mistake. She lunged for her purse, still sitting on the gala chair. Martinez's deputies reacted instantly, but I was closer. Years of training kicked in as I secured her arm, just as she was reaching for a USB drive. "Last chance," Barbara shouted, waving it frantically. "On this drive is dirt on everyone who's ever crossed me. City officials, board members, residents, everyone. Back off now, or I release everything." The crowd fell silent. Barbara's desperate grin faltered as she realized no one was backing down. In fact, people were stepping forward. "Release it," the paddles called out. "Show everyone," Sarah added. "We're not afraid anymore," Mr. Peterson declared, still comfortable in his lawn chair. Martinez gently took the USB drive. "This will be excellent evidence, along with the recording of that threat you just made." As the deputies led Barbara toward their car, the full weight of her downfall seemed to hit her. Her carefully constructed kingdom, built on intimidation and corruption, had crumbled in a single morning. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she was helped into the back seat, her designer heels sinking one last time into the immaculately maintained grass she had so obsessively regulated. But the biggest revelations were yet to come. What we found on that USB drive would shake our quiet suburban community to its core. Barbara hadn't just been running a corrupt HOA. She'd been orchestrating a years-long conspiracy that reached into City Hall itself. As Martinez's team began processing the scene, I looked around at my neighbors. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were survivors of Barbara's regime, finally free to live in their homes without fear. The sight of Lucy and Max playing basketball on their driveway, their hoop already reinstalled by helpful neighbors, said more than any investigation report could. "Hey, Officer Davis," Sarah called out, walking over with a box of Diwali decorations from the paddles. "We're thinking of having a real community celebration. One where everyone's actually welcome. What do you say?" I looked at my circular driveway, still blocked off by my vehicles, still decidedly not a VIP parking zone. I think I know the perfect place to host it. The fallout from Barbara Wellington's arrest was more extensive than anyone could have imagined. The USB drive turned out to be a treasure trove of corruption, implicating not just Barbara, but an entire network of officials and developers. She'd kept meticulous records of every bribe, every threat, and every backroom deal, apparently thinking it would protect her if things ever went south. Instead, it became the star evidence in what the local press dubbed HOA-gate. Within a month, 3 city council members resigned. The planning commission was dissolved and reformed. Barbara's husband, the former police chief, faced new investigations into old cases. The Wellington Development Group's projects were halted pending review, revealing a web of permit violations and environmental shortcuts. But the real changes happened right here in Oak Ridge Estates. The emergency HOA board election drew record participation. Sarah Chen, my next-door neighbor, became our new president, running on a platform of transparency and actual community values. Her first act? Establishing a residents' Bill of Rights, ensuring no board could ever again abuse their power the way Barbara had. The basketball hoops days, she announced at her first meeting, her kids grinning from the front row. And so do the Paddles Diwali decorations, the Johnsons' wheelchair ramp, and every other reasonable expression of home and family that makes this neighborhood worth living in. The changes were immediate and visible. Mr. Peterson's rose garden bloomed again. Children's laughter echoed from driveways and front yards. The Paddles hosted a magnificent Diwali celebration that brought the entire community together. Right in my circular driveway, which had become something of a symbol of resistance. Ted Wilkins, in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors, received community service instead of jail time. These days, he maintains the neighborhood's new community garden, where residents grow vegetables for the local food bank. His wife Nancy tells me he's never been happier. Barbara? She took a plea deal, but the terms were far from lenient. 5 years in state prison, restitution to the HOA, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board or community organization. Her precious Mercedes was seized as part of the asset forfeiture. It now serves as a patrol vehicle for our neighborhood watch program. The investigation revealed she'd embezzled over $300,000 from HOA funds over the years. Every homeowner received a restitution check, which most people donated to a new community improvement fund. Its first project? An inclusive playground designed to accommodate children of all abilities, including the Johnsons' son. My patrol car still sits proudly in my driveway, now joined occasionally by other first responders who've moved into the neighborhood. Turns out, when you're not driving people away with artificial rules and selective harassment, Oak Ridge Estates is a pretty desirable place to live. Last week, Sarah hosted our first annual Real Community Standards celebration. Unlike Barbara's canceled gala, this one actually celebrated our diversity and differences. The highlight was Mr. Peterson sharing stories about the neighborhood's history while teaching kids how to tend his roses. As I watched Lucy and Max playing basketball with their friends, their hoop now decorated with solar-powered lights, definitely not HOA approved under the old regime, Sarah walked over with a cup of coffee. "You know what the best part is?" she said, gesturing to the happy scene around us. "Nobody had to file a single violation notice to make this happen." I couldn't help but smile. Though I do keep expecting to get cited for having too much joy visible from the street. The investigation continues to uncover new layers of Barbara's corruption, but honestly, we're too busy being a real community to care much about that anymore. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about building something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. Oh, and one more thing, Sarah added with a grin. Remember that non-approved light bar on your patrol car that Barbara hated so much? We just voted to make red and blue lights the official holiday colors of Oak Ridge Estates. Justice comes in many forms. Sometimes it wears a badge, sometimes it carries a gavel, and sometimes Sometimes it just looks like kids playing basketball in a driveway that no one will ever again mistake for VIP parking.